should all have a binder in front of you. This has all the materials that we'll be going through the course of the day. And with all of that, let me then turn over the microphone and the podium to Sylvia Burwell, who's the new head of the Office of Management and Budget, and Steve Van Roekel, who is also the acting Deputy Director for Management, and therefore the chair of the President's Management Advisory Board.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. And first, I want to add my voice of welcome and thanks. One of the things that I know my experience actually about an advisory group like this in previous positions I've had is terrific in terms of the value that it can add to one's thinking and one's direction. And I think that has already been seen in some of the work that you all are doing. I hope over the last weeks that you have seen some of the follow-up to the types of management work that everyone has been talking about, whether that's some of the permitting things that have been going forward that the President spoke to quite recently. Those are the types of things that these conversations lead to, which is a deep focus on specific places where we can actually make a quick difference. And I think I use permitting as the type of example. I think the visa issues that but all those kinds of issues are the kinds of things where a group like this and a conversation like this, I think, can help us focus quickly on places that we can make progress on the management side of the agenda for the entire government and one of the main responsibilities of OMB. I think you all probably know it's week 5 for me. So I am just here and just entering in to the fray, but really wanted to come by and make sure that I stop by because I think this is an important part of what will be happening hopefully over the next 3.5 years in terms of the time that people like me will be here. But I actually think it's about the next 10 years and that's a very important perspective for us all to have, is to change the way we do and the way we think about how we can most effectively and efficiently deliver for the American people. And in my hearings, you can go to the record, and as I was asked about priorities, one of the big priorities that we spent time in my hearings discussing was what is called the M side of OMB, which is the management piece of this. And so it is something that I and the team will be spending time on. I think right now, you know, Steve has graciously agreed. So right now at OMB, the Acting Deputy Director for Management, who was the chair, Danny Werfel, and also controller of the U.S. government, is now the acting director at the IRS. So Steve has graciously agreed during this interim period where we're close, hopefully, and over time we'll have our decision and go through the nomination process with a Deputy Director for Management appointee. But Steve has agreed to do 2 roles for us during this time. And so we're privileged and pleased and happy to have that. I know this organization, I also want to say thank you and lock you into hopefully another 2 years of service. In terms of thanking you and recognizing the importance of continuing this work, and I think also conversations about how we, I think, may need to add a person or 2 over time to this work, which is something that I think Steve and others will address. So with that, the one thing I just think is we really do want to focus on specific things that have impact and have change, and that those things are implementable, they are measurable, they are understandable, and they are supportable. One of the things, we are the executive branch, and that's where much of implementation of government occurs, but we must and need to work closely with our colleagues on the Hill. And I actually think this is a terrific place where we have a lot of opportunity for agreement. And so I think this is actually an area of opportunity where we can come up with great ideas that we can work on and have the support of the Congress in implementing. So with that, I want to say a very large thank you. I'm going to look forward to, I know this is our first meeting of 2013, and I will look forward to, as we evolve, the opportunity to be able to spend some more time over time with you all. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve for the agenda and to kick us off and get started. And I also want to thank our government colleagues who are here today, who are also the people who are implementing many of these things and are committed to these kinds of issues. So thank you all too around the table. Some of you I've had a chance to spend some time with, and others I'm in the process of doing. So thank you, and I will look forward to seeing you all again. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
good luck.
Congratulations.
Yes, really.
Congratulations.
I don't know if say congratulations or condolences.
Yeah.
I
But
will
keep
say,
that
as I
attitude.
shared with some others, that actually what you just said, a number of senators during the confirmation process did actually start with condolences. But fortunately, I was at OMB once before and in government, and I think things are harder in certain ways, but I am excited and have come because I believe we can have impact. And I really do believe that this is a place where progress can be made. And even in my first weeks here, in the first 5 weeks, actually on the M side, I've seen a couple things, whether it's the open data, the permitting, some of the regulatory issues making some headway. It's a place actually where I think we can get traction and move even more quickly. We'll need to make that progress on the B side and working hard on that every day. But this is a place where I think there is just a lot of opportunity, especially with your all's ideas and support. So thank you.
Well done. Thank you.
Well, for an agenda today, we're going to start the day kind of recapping a couple of the 2012 initiatives. This is really a report-out session on strategic sourcing and our work, important work we've been doing on improper payments. And then we're going to have a couple deep dives. One is on real estate optimization. We've got Dan Tangerlini here from GSA to talk about what we're doing, and really, I think, have a nice discussion at an executive level around how you all think about real estate, and then hopefully connect with your professionals inside your organizations to have a fruitful conversation there. And then the last section we're going to do is something we've been working on a lot, which is hardwiring innovation, having a fruitful discussion on how we inspire innovation really at all levels of the organization, not just an innovation team or a cohort, but bringing innovation to process and people and our use of technology, both facing inside government and out. And so I think we'll have a great set of questions for you and a great discussion during that time. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Joe Jordan to get us started on strategic sourcing. Thank you, Sylvia.
We're just behind tag, for those of you following along.
Thank you, Sylvia. Congrats.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
We're going to go to slide 10, actually. So strategic sourcing is one of the items that many of you helped us with during the last PMAB period. If you look at slide 11, just to level set where we were when we first kicked off this initiative, Dan and I talked to you about the fragmentation of buying across government, that we'd had enough data to show that this fragmented buying approach was causing significant price and cost variance, and are looking for the data in and of itself showed a real need around getting more of that information. And so we said there's certainly a large opportunity here if we can come together, be smarter and more thoughtful in our acquisitions, take administrative costs out of the system, and really leverage the government's buying power. We spent some time with all of you and your experts, visiting some of your companies and getting ideas. At the last meeting, we adopted a set of recommendations from the PMAB, or we received, a set of recommendations that PMAB adopted on how we could actually implement this. How can we go out and capture some of this opportunity? And so moving to slide 12, while we are now still in a crawl, walk, run, iterative process with strategic sourcing, we want to be smart and thoughtful while still moving as aggressively as possible where we see opportunity that we can capture. We've got some significant results even since the last meeting. So we have implemented the recommendations that the PMAB delivered. Every agency now has a senior accountable official for strategic sourcing. We created that Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council I briefed those of you who were on the last call about, where the big 7 agencies, because one of the things we heard from you and your experts was focus on where the dollars actually are, kind of put a Pareto principle around this. And so we took the 7 agencies that control about 92% of the spend. They now sit on a Strategic Sourcing Leadership Council along with the SBA, because we need to have our small and disadvantaged businesses literally and figuratively at the table for all of these conversations. And we've started to roll out certain commodity teams, build certain commodity teams, and roll out certain vehicles. So already during just this fiscal year in direct savings, we've captured about $50 million in savings. There's also tens of millions of dollars more in indirect savings, the administrative savings, where instead of standing up 15 different contracts for the exact same good or service. We are consolidating those down. We are standardizing terms and conditions so then the vendor doesn't have to have a whole set of different bid and proposals. We heard that from some of your folks as well from the other side saying, hey, when we deal with different agencies, even though theoretically you guys have the same rules, we have to create a whole new set of proposal documents because the agencies just ask for things a little bit differently. So we've really streamlined a lot of that. Now, one particular success story that's happened since our last meeting and shows the collaboration among the agencies as well as the collaboration between GSA as really the implementation lead for a number of strategic sourcing efforts and OMB helping shape the policy and chair the SLC is in the wireless category. Literally the example we used, you saw on slide 11, this slide 11 was the one we showed you, about a year ago. That was one that we attacked, and Dan is going to talk us through a little bit of what his team was able to do.
Make sure you cover, it would be great to cover the example again. Just talk about what we found in Atlanta.
Sure.
Because I think it tees up what you're doing.
I mean, so Joe said 15 different contracts, if only.
Yeah, right.
Our inventory showed this. We had over 4,000 different contracts and 800 different plans. The joke was my own family bought wireless better than the federal government did. And so we've collapsed those 4,000 contracts and 800 plans into one contract and one plan with 4 different vendors. And the idea is then to bring that scale together, bring the resources together, and that will allow us then in subsequent negotiations to begin to leverage that scale to drive down the price. So that's part of the challenge. That's the outcome. Now, fighting our way through it was not easy in the sense that the vendors knew that there was some margin that was on the table there, and so it took us a long time because of protests, re-protests, changes. But by sticking through it and keeping the agencies together, and I really compliment Joe and his leadership, making sure that people focused on the outcome and the result.
Out of curiosity, how much money was saved?
We have some estimates, but part of the problem is we don't really have data on what we're actually spending. So what we need to do is pool the different participants. We think it could be 30 million in 5 years, but we think that that's very, very conservative. Things like sharing minutes, not having the ability to turn off roaming, particularly for those people working along the border, where they would flip over to, we'll call them non-domestic carriers that had very high roaming charges. Those are all costs that were being borne by the fact that we hadn't negotiated as an enterprise to get the best bargain. So we're going to look, now that we do actually have people participating, and try to match what the expenditures will be under this program versus prior programs, and use that as an opportunity then to refine those contracts and get better outcomes.
So one of the things that we've always dealt with is when you try to make a big change, there's always some pocket of resistance to that change. If you had one thing that you got resistance that would have a big impact on savings, what would that be? Meaning something that people are saying, no, that can't be changed. Is there anything that comes to mind that if you could say, yeah, we will make that change? I understand it's not easy, but
I have some ideas, but I'm wondering.
okay, all right. I just think those are the things that.
Yeah.
I think that there are two sides. One was, as Dan said, what were the negotiating points with the vendor? And some of those were wrong. How do you create, as Steve terms it, the family plan for government? But then from the user perspective, it's really, the one thing I heard a lot about was the device. People have a somewhat emotional attachment to their device at times. And if you're trying to standardize, what we showed before was a fully loaded data plan in the exact same metropolitan environment. So really trying to compare apples to apples, we saw wild variance. To streamline that, you do need some device rationalization. And while that might work for 90%, those few are really aggressive. And then the other thing that you'll see in any strategic sourcing initiative, I know Tim Salso's not here, but his folks at Cummins really drove it home when they did it there, and it was the folks in the engine factory saying, I got this can of Loctite for $1 cheaper than you guys have, so I get better pricing than strategically sourced vehicle. That's totally missing the point. It's what are you getting in total, and are we losing from all those types of things? Sometimes takes more than a 30-second elevator pitch with the person who we're now taking a little bit of control away in delivering huge savings to their agency.
I mean,
a lot of companies, and we're actually embarking on this at the Red Cross, have a bring your own device, but we are not maintaining it rule.
Yes.
And they don't pay for the device. So everybody has a personal device and a work device, and we are paying for the minutes, but we're not paying for the device. And there were so many IT professionals that were maintaining these devices, and they could all go away, and the expense of maintaining it goes away. I mean, it's something to think about.
Absolutely.
And then plus everyone gets a device. People that don't need the device get a device.
So we did 2 motions in the last 12 months on that front. One is we issued last summer bring your own device guidance for government-wide.
Yeah.
And so that's now out there. May 23rd was the 1-year anniversary of our digital strategy. I did see the Red Cross ship their Tornado app, which was very cool on using some open government data kind of on the heels of that strategy. But one of the things that came out in that May 23rd deliverable was a set of security guidelines for the vendor community to tell the device manufacturers, here's what we'd like to see when you serve government from a technology standpoint, kind of laying the cards on the table on where we want to see the technology go. Those 2 things marrying up is starting to create a phenomenon inside government. And even in the White House, we have a bring your own device policy. Now, I carry only my personal device with an app that works within our security guidelines. And so it's starting to have an effect, and I think it's going to continue with this new technology specification. It'll actually allow the device to the work experience to take over the device, and so because the thing we have to worry a lot about is and are very diligent on is records retention and things very very similar to the finance community and corporate environment and things like that. So we have to watch out for that and think about how that works in the context of bringing your own device.
And one other thing for Steve, Steve's work building on this is the portfolio stat initiative that you've heard about. Mm-hmm. That's helping us identify within agencies where there may be zero-use devices, to your point, Gail, or some of the data that we need to capture to be able to tell you, hey, exactly how much are we saving and what are we doing? And so it's another kind of cross-management, cross-agency effort that is mutually reinforcing. I'm sorry, Shantanu.
No, that's okay. What incentives do you have for departments who save money? If it's I lose my budget and I don't get any of the savings back, then what's sort of the incentive for people to participate? So as you think about this is great. Are there ways in which you're going to sort of funnel some of that back into other initiatives in the department?
So our IT budget guidance for last year that formulated the President's 2014 budget was a cut and invest strategy. So it was asking agencies to cut 10% of their IT spend, and we gave them specific areas that were focus areas, riding on the heels of strategic sourcing and portfolio stat. We automatically then gave them back 5% of that, but gave them areas where we wanted to see that invested. It was employee productivity, customer service, or cybersecurity were the 3 major categories. And then we asked them, each agency, to give us 5% priority add backs, which would be if you could net to zero, what are the additional 5% you would spend on in that context. And what was amazing is the agencies who did the hard work, if you look at our federal IT spend, we were actually up 78 basis points from the last year. And so it's starting to work, where we're starting to create this sort of depreciation mindset, which is very foreign to government because the ROI is never realized in the place that you save it. And so we want to create that virtuous cycle. And so that mentality is going to continue forward on kind of how do we cut and invest, how you take from the bottom of the list, add to the top, take from OpEx, give to CapEx in a way that we can drive this forward. And the incentive structure we've created is the agencies who work the hardest got the most support from us in really doing the innovative ideas.
And I think, Sean, that never waste a crisis kind of mindset. Right. This is the perfect time for strategic sourcing because due to factors even beyond OMB control, there is downward fiscal pressure. And therefore, David, Maurice, and John can say more about how effective strategic sourcing is in handing them some of these tools, but saying, look, you can plow these savings back into mission, especially in short term. Over the long run, we figure out how to give as much of it possible back to the taxpayer. But in short term, it's get the exact same commodity that you were buying before at the same quality, just for lower price. John and I spoke to the Department of Transportation Acquisition Workforce on Tuesday, and this was one of our shared messages. Look, we're joined together and saying, this is the smart way to do the buying, and then plow that back into the mission where you have these gaps created by the downward pressure. So just finishing up, we talked about wireless. There are other initiatives we've launched. I know office supplies we talked about a lot, and we've seen significant savings there. We spoke to you about, and I think there was a clear sense from the PMAP, drive up the value chain, start with those commodities where you can build the successes, show the clear wins, and then move up. So now we're doing that, and we've got a pipeline of things like laboratory supply, some of the IT hardware that Steve's team has identified through Portfolio Stat, and then moving into things that are more in the services, but not the really complex services, but I think will take some time, but more building maintenance and operations and things of that nature. So one more thing that really was driven home during our work together, to Gail, your point about, well, how much, or exactly you're saying, where it's the data. We don't have great prices paid data. Dan just said that. It was something that was a shock to me when I walked in this job about 18 months ago. There's no place I can go look and say, even though I know every agency buys these binders, how much do we pay per binder? I know how much we pay to the vendor per buy. It's all the end spending is all transparent, but the price per unit is nowhere to be found. I mean, without a significant amount of roll up your sleeves elbow grease, which I know Dan's team has done a lot of. So we're building a prices paid portal. GSA is running point, but we've got DoD involved since they have so much of the spend, and OMB is using whatever resources we can apply from a policy perspective to try to launch first a pilot, prove it out. We're going to pick some IT categories and some other commodities where we've already got strategically sourced vehicles, and get that data, show the price variance, show the best low cost and low price options of the strategically sourced vehicles, drive the demand there, and then create that virtuous cycle that we all talked about.
That's great.
That's
Great things happening. As you see, I shake things up right away by changing the order in the slides. Let's go back.
On the management team, we are ready for anything. Steve likes to keep us on our toes.
Nimble.
With you.
Good job. Let's go back to slide 5, and Norm Dong is our Deputy Federal Controller. He's going to take us through the work we've been doing on improper payments.
Good morning, everyone. Before we actually get into the slides, I want to step back and provide folks with a quick snapshot of the progress that we're making in improper payments. We're continuing to see a positive trend in terms of the error rate, and when we calculated the error rate for fiscal year 12, we saw that it had dropped to about 4.35%, and I contrast that to the high water mark of 5.4% that we saw in fiscal year 9. So we're making movements in the right direction. And if you look at the programs that have traditionally had chronically high error rates, like Medicare fee-for-service and Medicaid and the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, as well as UI, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, even with those programs, we saw that the rate was notching down slightly as well. So again, I think we're kind of moving in the right direction. But even when you take that 4.35% error rate and you apply it to the base of all federal spending, that's still a big number. And we calculate that to be about $180 billion. So I think that underscores the fact that we still have a big challenge in front of us. So I want to just recap some of the earlier conversations that we've had with this group in terms of improper payments. Prior discussions, we focused on 2 overarching questions. One is looking at corporate best practices among the organizations sitting around this table for addressing error and fraud prevention and detection. And then more specifically talking about actions that the federal government should take based on the experience around this table in terms of managing improper payments and errors. And I want to recap some of the key findings that have come out of this group. And what we heard was the following. One is we can't try to do it all at once. We can't try to boil the ocean, but we really need to be focusing on a subset of improper payments. And based on that discussion, our efforts have focused largely on trying to move the needle in terms of unemployment insurance and trying to bring that rate down, but then also looking at what Treasury is doing government-wide through its Do Not Pay portal, and we're going to talk about each of those in a few minutes. We also had conversation in terms of looking at game-changing approaches and focusing really on the issues of incentive and governance. And I think you'll see a lot of that when we talk about the state-led model for unemployment insurance through the Integrity Center. Discussion around standardizing data to lay the foundation for more effective matching and analytics. And if you look at the work that's going on at Treasury right now, they're looking to standardize payment data so that as agencies send information to Treasury to make disbursements, they're taking the same approach in terms of embedding those transactions with the key information to help with fraud and improper payments detection and prevention. And then finally, on the issue of data analytics, a lot of conversation around that in the past. And what we're seeing right now is more of that across the federal government, but looking particularly at Treasury and Do Not Pay. They are building that capacity as they stand up the Do Not Pay program. A couple of examples of some of the analysis that we're doing. Treasury's worked with one agency to examine the distribution of age, of beneficiaries by age, to see does that pattern, does the data indicate the pattern that you would expect? So again, just being able to do some initial analysis to say, hey, that may not look right and be a red flag that requires further review. And another example is where the Do Not Pay program is providing analytic support to the Treasury OIG to help diverted payment fraud. That's when you take somebody's bank account number and you're routing it away from the original source to fraudulent actor. So if we go to the next slide on page 6, I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about the progress that we've been making with the UI Integrity Center of Excellence. As many of you may know from earlier discussions, the UI Center of Excellence is a partnership that we have with the New York State Department of Labor to develop and implement innovative strategies to prevent fraud and improper payments. And really, New York is serving as the lead among all of the states, and the work that we're seeing in New York will benefit all 50 states to build capacity among the states, again, with an emphasis on data analytics and predictive modeling to support state efforts. As the center goes forward, we're focusing on a few key priorities. One is, as I said before, data analytics and predictive modeling methodologies and tools. 2 is developing a secure alert system to update states quickly to new fraud schemes. And what I want to underscore the fact that it is secure, as we were talking about this with the Department of Labor yesterday. It needs to be secure because A, we don't want to tip off the fraudsters as we make this information available. And B, we want to be able to share that information with the states and not have other potential fraudsters kind of take a look at what's going on. So we need to keep that information very tightly held. Big focus on best practices and being able to identify what we're seeing across the landscape and make sure that all states are benefiting from the innovations that we're seeing. And then finally, major focus on training. And what we're going to be doing is looking at analytic capability and program integrity capability across the state landscape and seeing where there are big gaps and seeing where there are trends and be able to develop a program, again, with New York State taking the lead to be able to address those gaps as we go forward. In our initial few months, we had awarded the grant, when was it, Gay? In September of last year to New York State. So we've been focusing with them in terms of standing up the initial program infrastructure. Some steering committees have been established, focusing on, again, data analytics, the portals and the information technology element, as well as training. So, slide 7 provides the outlook ahead in terms of what we see as some of the key deliverables on the horizon. Let me bring us back to the issue of training. This month, the training subcommittee is going to be beginning to assess state integrity capability and training needs, so that launches this month. Back to the secure fraud portal, we're currently going through the procurement process, but we expect to be able to stand that up by around October of 2013. That's our target for launching that. And then as we look into fiscal year 14, that's when we're going to see more activity in terms of the data analytics and the predictive modeling capability, not just in terms of developing the system, but also in terms of hiring and building the staff capacity as well.
You know, when we first started talking about IT, we had talked about how government sometimes creates sort of, bespoke systems or systems for themselves. And, this is probably an area of research and innovation right now in the Valley that's second to none, right? I mean, big data and what are you doing to find ways in which people can analyze data for whether it's credit card fraud or, what's happening on the web, etc. So I'd really encourage you as you look at this, rather than create, again, a sort of standalone separate system. There is more dollars that are going in venture to big data and analytics than I think any time in software's history. So I think there's a lot. A trip to the West Coast and just seeing what companies are up to in this space, I think would be very effective use of your time.
Yeah, I would second that and think that if you look at companies that are in the credit card space, they have very detailed analytic models to predict fraud and to be able to triangulate specific transactions with specific individuals and send up red flags. I know at American Express there's an enormous amount of analytical capability.
Yeah, I think on our Recovery Accountability Transparency Board that was stood up by an act of Congress after the Recovery Act was issued, they engaged a lot of big data and forensics companies to do work there, and it was seen as a really great example. And I think you're spot on thinking about that in the space as well.
And I know that last year we had some initial visits with a few companies, but I think we're not done yet in terms of the research and information gathering. So I think it's time well spent to continue that effort to see, how corporate side is approaching this issue, and again to learn from those lessons as we move forward in the government space.
As we've been working through this, we've gotten obviously focused down on the specific issues that you've already pointed to, Shamsi. That is the data analytics and the capacity to extract from that data the patterns of behavior that you want to flag as you do go through all of these things.
Right.
And I know Gabe Gilbert, who's the program manager for the Department of Labor, is just sitting in the back there. Yeah, we've talked with some of the folks in some of the tech firms, have we not?
We did have some presentations from eBay that were very helpful, and that was all part of our learning in this space
Exactly.
to guide our efforts. We also spent a lot of time with the Medicaid, or Medicare, excuse me, their fraud lab, and they've been engaging in data analytics now for a couple of years to gain a lot of their learning and how they approach their assets. So Norm is correct. We're still in a learning mode, so I think we're working with this.
Yeah, most definitely.
During the administrative portion, at the end of this session, we're going to talk about membership. So this is a huge area of opportunity for the government. I think as we think about PMAP membership, there may be some additional professionals you could suggest that come in and bring real insights into the space,
Yep.
both on the big and small side.
Okay, I'm going to shift the conversation to focus more on Do Not Pay, which starts on slide 8. And I'm very excited about the progress that we've made over the past year with the Do Not Pay program. Just to recall that the Do Not Pay program is a centralized data matching service launched last year, run by the Treasury Department. And the service allows us, agencies, to check multiple databases to determine a recipient's award or payment eligibility. And, as we build this program, we're focusing with a core of 2 data sets, the Death Master file, as well as the excluded parties list system. And that is, I would consider, the standard that we use for all the payments. But then based on what agencies have in terms of existing authorities or additional authorities, we're accessing other data sets as well, which you see listed here on slide 8 in terms of the debt check database, the work number, as well as the central contractor registration. And since we launched the program last year, we've been working to address and balance several key challenges. One is balancing the need to share information with the need to respect and follow privacy rules. But then also the challenge of how do we integrate this new Do Not Pay process into agency business processes. So the milestone that we just hit last weekend was by June 1st, we had set out to run all federal payments as appropriate through the Do Not Pay program. And as we were thinking about this, we first focused on agencies doing it one by one for the pre-disbursement process. And we decided that that's probably a better way of doing it, where if agencies are already sending payment information to Treasury, why not do it on a centralized basis where Treasury takes that information and screens it against these data sets and then figures out the hits. So that's the approach that we're taking, and we think it is a much more effective way of achieving scale across the federal government, and that's what we launched as of June 1st. And in terms of how we act upon those hits, we recognize that not all hits translate into stops. There may be a valid reason why a dead person is being paid. So, for example, the beneficiary may...
I can't wait to hear this.
A beneficiary may be paid, or survivor may be paid the beneficiary's benefit. So it's not an absolute rule where, you see a dead person, you've got to not make the payment. You've got to understand what's going on, what's the backstory on that transaction. So we want to be more thoughtful in terms of understanding what's going on agency by agency to make the right decision, as opposed to simply stopping all payments and then when they in fact may be valid payments. So the process for doing that is, as Treasury takes the payment information coming from the agencies, they screen it against the data sets that I just described, and they'll take the list of hits. They push the list of hits back out to the agencies for adjudication and disposition. So let's just say Treasury finds 100 hits for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We send that information back to Maurice's team, and they run those hits to ground. And they may decide, okay, 10 are actually valid payments, but 90 are payments that should be stopped. And that allows us to make a more thoughtful and thorough review of all the payments and make sure that people who should be paid are getting paid, and those who are not will not get paid. And then we want to see the feedback loop. We actually want to see how those hits are being disposed of one way or the other. So as Treasury pushes out this information at the beginning of the month, agencies are required to send disposition reports back to Treasury and to OMB at the end of the month. So that gives us that cycle where we can see how the hits translated either into stops or valid payments.
So your overall rate is 4 point something percent.
4.35.
Is there a point where you say, okay, I'm now spending more to chase this than I am the upside? And do you know where that is?
We've set an initial goal of 97% accuracy or 3% error, which I think is stretching us beyond where we have been historically. And I think it reflects kind of the fact that you'll never get 100% accuracy. And then also, as we look at some of these payments, not all of the payments are overpayments. Some of the payments are actually documentation errors where, so let's just say I've got a contract where the vendor did the work, but the period of performance, it had gone beyond the period of performance. You could argue that that vendor was entitled to that payment because they did the work, but you didn't do the paperwork to adjust the period of performance.
She's saying, do we have a target for
3%.
a line we draw?
3% is what I heard. Right?
Yeah, but that's the goal. I don't know if that's the cost benefit
Yeah, I'm
analysis
just trying to
line
figure
that
out
says that
that-
operationally it costs more.
Yeah, the process that you described to me sounded a little labor intensive. You're sending it one place, somebody has to investigate everything, they send it back. And I'm sure we're nowhere near this point, but taken to its illogical conclusion, you're going to be spending more money chasing after this than you're getting upside. And I just wondered if you had a feeling for that, because you can't always police the unpoliceable. I mean, no matter how great your data analytics get, these fraudsters find they're like water. They just sort of find the path of least resistance.
We want to be able to monitor the initial results closely as they come back from the agencies. So if we see that this is a huge grind for the agencies and it's so labor intensive and it's just kind of grinding everything to a halt, then we may need to adjust how we approach this. And to that end, we also want to use technology and automation so that it's less of a manual process, and that as we learn on how agencies adjudicate this, why not just build that into the business rules up front so that you're slowly, hopefully more than slowly, quickly moved out of the process of having a manual, very labor-intensive approach to a more automated approach.
Well, along those lines, as you were talking about, so the example you gave of if someone's dead, it turns out it's a legacy payment to their estate. Shouldn't that be, or can't you handle that in data entry? I mean, I'm just thinking about why you wouldn't, to Gail's point, why I was struck by running all that down. So when you go back to your data warehouse, is there an opportunity for more what I call sophisticated mapping so that you don't have all these exceptions hitting the screen, and so if someone dies, they flip into a PS1 number, and then, I'm just thinking about you maybe want to go a little step forward in the data entry process to eliminate some of these.
When we talked about data standardization in terms of the information that we're putting in our payment file going to Treasury, that is something that we can do more standardly across the board.
Yeah.
So if I'm putting in data that shows that it's actually to a survivor, then it's
a
not going to be
different
flagged
code.
later on.
It's
I'm
a
not going to have to
different
do
code.
all that back end work.
Right, so you are doing kind of the front
Yeah,
stream
we're beginning
data
to work with
cleansing,
Treasury.
analytics, right.
Figure out, okay, what is the core set of information that I need to see on every payment?
And one thing you may want to consider, there's 3 companies in the United States that probably pay 75% of every private sector employee between ADP, Paychex, and Ceridian. And you may actually want to just go talk to them about if we were going to try and solve this problem, is there a creative way? Because they literally are cutting checks every week, every other week. And there may be some knowledge they have, or there may be some data feeds they can give you that would be a Social Security lookup or something that would say to the UI, to the state UI agencies, look, this person's receiving a check from an employer, there's no reason to pay them. So I would say those, I'm pretty sure they pay at least 70, if not more, of the private sector at this point.
I think the other due out I'm hearing from this is just us going back and making sure that we're tracking, super diligently tracking the cost structures of the process, and goaling ourselves around optimizing both productivity and cycle time. That drives us to technology or other things, and then we can metric against that. I think your assumption is right, that it's 3% is still a win, but not all the way there on a cost-benefit analysis that as well.
So one of the other things I just want to highlight, just following off of Liz's question, the reason for what Treasury is in the process of doing by capturing the adjudication results is to figure out what are those things that should be built into the front of the system.
Right.
So trying to build a bit of the closed loop,
Yeah.
but we're still at the sort of beginning stages of figuring out what are those components of data that do need to be baked into the front end of the system.
Well, so that'll make the whole cost of compliance analysis a little bit slippery because presumably you're going to be getting better and better and better and automate a lot of this, so.
So the line can move in.
Yeah.
Norm, can you hit it says at the top, as appropriate? Just want to make sure we don't skim over that. Junior, all federal payments as appropriate. Just want to make sure that's not a big hole we can drive the truck through.
Sure. We interpret it as appropriate 2 ways. One is we don't want to duplicate work that's already being done. So if you look at the pre-award process, there's a system called SAM where agencies are already doing a lookup against these same databases. So we didn't want to make them repeat that process and do that twice. Secondly, while Treasury disperses most of the federal payments, it's not all of the federal payments. So there are other dispersing organizations in the federal government where there's some systems limitations right now that prevent us from moving 100% of their payments through Do Not Pay, but those are issues that we're working on.
We think that's a pretty small thing.
Yeah. Slide 9, real quick, just to summarize. The road ahead, our focus is on developing an implementation guide that helps make this process, to help institutionalize the process across the federal agencies, as well as to reach out to states and let them access the Do Not Pay program for state administrative payments. Also, we talked before about how we're just using 2 databases in terms of the death master file and the excluded parties list. We want to be able to add other data sets into the Do Not Pay program. We look at CAVERS at Department of Housing and Urban Development. That helps us determine creditworthiness, and it helps us with the eligibility question. But then also we look at the work number for unemployment insurance. Again, that provides detailed earnings data that helps us, again, have a better sense of program eligibility.
How comfortable are you with the metrics that you're using to measure the activity and the yield on each activity?
In terms of how we are disposing of the hits, let me make sure I understand.
In the whole program, you have a set of activities you're engaging in. And some activities will have a greater yield of do not pay than other activities. And so how comfortable are you that in tracking that you have good metrics by agency, by activity, that gives you a sense as to where the yield actually is? Not all activities will have an equivalent yield, I would assume.
Yeah, as we look forward to the results that we're going to be sharing with the agencies, I think that'll give us a better sense. So in some of our initial work, for example, we saw that there were a lot of false positives. So again, it kind of comes back to, you know, the labor intensity of this effort, and are we getting a lot of false positives, and are we getting a lot of noise here? And again, what do we do to kind of change some of the business rules and do more of the upfront work so that you're not creating a lot of work at the back end? But we will know better as we begin to see the results coming off of, you know, all payments running through June, through Do Not Pay, which started June 1st.
Skipping around once again. Dan Tingerly, he's the GSA acting administrator. The president has nominated him to be the president.
Sorry, Steve. Steve. Oh,
Steve.
I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
So I was bouncing over slide 13, bouncing over to Dan
Okay.
Tangerlini. He's the acting administrator of our General Services Administration, and very recently the president nominated him to be the permanent administrator. So.
Well, maybe not permanent.
You can never leave.
Right.
That's a little scary.
The death file.
Yeah, the
or
job.
something.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Steve. And I think that this is much like the Strategic Sourcing Initiative, an example where if you focus on what you take to be fixed costs, you can try to make them variable so that you can then drive them down. We have a working assumption. I think it's a pretty safe one, and that is that the federal government has more real estate under lease than is needed to carry out its missions and activities. And we've identified, we've gone through a process over the last several years. The administration has been very focused on this issue. We've identified properties that we can either repurpose and consolidate agencies into, or we can put back into the marketplace. In fact, you probably just heard that this week we finalized the terms with the Trump Organization for them to do a 60-year out lease of the old post office building and turn that into a hotel. We also released an RFP where we're looking to work with private sector partners in Silicon Valley to help us operate them off at Federal Airfield and use that operations to get investment in a historic structure. So we are pushing very hard on finding ways that we can leverage these assets. We believe that by eliminating these underutilized or excess properties or getting improved utilization of the properties we have, we can drive down the cost of operations. And we think there are second-order effects in terms of reducing the tail, the administrative tail that goes with those programs, as well as, I'll talk a little bit about this, really pushing up productivity as we find ways for people to collaborate and cooperate and just even bump into each other in the hallways. We've made significant progress. The President and OMB have issued a variety of guidance around telling agencies that they really need to look in at this particular line item, challenging them to be more aggressive about approaching the way they physically organize themselves, and encouraging people to work together, collaborate, and particularly work with GSA on trying to find ways that we can better manage these assets. We've already generated more than $8 billion in savings over the last 3 years, and we've adopted a pretty aggressive policy, a hard ceiling policy of zero growth in the federal real estate portfolio. Now, GSA, we want to do better than zero, and that's our goal. We're pushing agencies to push down. We think the opportunity, as I said, is by shrinking and maximizing, well, not maximizing, but shrinking the federal government's sprawling real estate portfolio, maximizing the utilization. How did I not catch that? Will allow each agency to realize its efficiencies and savings, which can be directed towards other mission-critical activities. Push it back into mission, return it to the taxpayer. Don't put it into space that you're not using. But we have some challenges. Like strategic sourcing, we have very limited visibility. We can look through a porthole, frankly. We don't get a picture window into what agencies' real estate holdings are, how agencies use that real estate, even how many people come in and out of the buildings in a given day. We are concerned about developing a shared government-wide goal. We're very concerned about developing a one-size-fits-none policy that then creates a lot of agency pushback. So we have to figure out ways that we can come up with some metrics or some strategies that agencies can accept and they can adopt. Real estate is long lead time, and the savings is needed now. Part of the problem is, as we see lease expirations coming up, we've been working on that with agencies for 36, 24, 12 months. Some of the exigency, some of the focus, some of the energy that we're feeling now may not have been felt several years back. And so how do we make sure that we're not going concrete, if you will, around the government we had rather than the government we want? And then cost. Even fast payback projects, projects that pay back in 13 months when you have a 12-month budget cycle, a hard budget cycle, and you have issues as we've had with getting appropriations, even fast payback projects are hard to actually buy. So current tactics, some of the things we're doing, we're trying to create not just bigger, but better data on real estate planning and basic trying to get aligned government-wide data collection to decision-making, getting agencies to contribute more, focusing on what we're asking agencies about, trying to develop deeper understanding of agencies' portfolio. Freezing the footprint. We're going to tell agencies and work with agencies to say, look, there's no expansion policy. If you need to expand within your current resources, or work very closely with OMB to explain it and justify. We got to trust, but we also have to verify. So we're asking agencies to develop their plans, provide those plans to OMB. We'll work closely with OMB to try to understand what the needs of the agencies are going forward. We need to encourage the adoption of flexible workplace management practices. At our headquarters, GSA, we just opened 2 weeks ago a new space where 80% of the offices are now hoteling, only 20% are assigned. I sit in a 6,000 square foot area with about 50 people. We went from the distance between the two other chief leaders in my organization in 2 separate buildings being about 4 miles to being less than 40 feet. And I tell you, it's a powerful message when people walk up and they see I'm sitting at a desk not much bigger than this end of the table. It's kind of hard for them to start complaining about the actual turf that we're fighting for now with agencies and organizations. Every square foot that goes into space is every dollar that goes into space is $1 less that can go into program. We also need to get ahead of the curve by developing a better, more robust, and more thoughtful long-term real estate planning process. Real estate is a long-term lead item. It really does define, to some extent, a big chunk of a cost structure, so we really need to start describing where we want to go if we have any hope of trying to get there. We also need to find ways that we can cut to the chase, and when we are done with the property, when it's being accessed, when it's time to put it to a different use, we need to find ways to get through the legislative and legal process to get it out into the market. The administration has a proposal. There's also a proposal on the House. There's a proposal in the Senate for reforming the ways we deal with civilian, non-military real estate. So, as they say, those are the 3 ingredients you need in Washington to make anything legislatively, the administration, the House, and the Senate. We think we can probably work out a deal to try to move something forward, hopefully, in this Congress. So that leads to how PMAP can help us. We have a couple of questions for discussion. I hope we'll generate some response. Maybe you can even respond if these aren't the right questions. But how have you identified underperforming assets in your real estate portfolio? How do you do that? How do you figure it out? And how do you overcome the incentives within your own organizations for people to hold on to those assets? I imagine what we see in the federal government is probably replicated in your organizations as well. Is real estate planning a corporate-wide exercise? Is it something you do at the corporate level, or do you do it at a sub-corporate level? Do you let something below the corporate level make those decisions? So for us, it would be: is it at the administration level, or is it at the agency level, or is it at the local or regional level? And then how do you think about the balance between pushing improvements in units that are less advanced versus across-the-board mandates? So how do we strike that balance of trying to do smart cuts with just forced cuts? You know, how do you handle that within your organizations? And then how do you think about structuring the goal-setting process to ensure that you do in fact get buy-in? So even if you are getting to the hard cut, the mandate side, how do you make sure that people aren't squirting around you and figuring out every which way to not deliver the outcome? Those are some of the questions perhaps we could we can talk about.
Run the folder property we're expecting them to buy from us.
Right. Exactly.
Oh, yeah, we'll do that later.
Section timeshare.
I would tell you,
Federal Airfield, the RFP is out there.
So I would tell you though, I mean, these are good questions. Corporate-led, kind of top-down management of your employee base and your real estate kind of go hand in hand, meaning where do you want your workforce to be? What do you want the real estate footprint to look like? These are mandates. These aren't things that if you leave it up to the little individual units, they're going to get anywhere. And so I'm sure if you go talk to the real estate managers, they will say that they have big support from the executives in the company on which direction you're going to go. And it is pretty top down. I would tell you there's really easy techniques on underperforming assets now. Everything from how many people badge in to a location. I mean, some of the work that was done where I used to work, we ran reports and we had small offices in places where there was minimal utilization just from the badging reports, and we just shut those down. I mean, it was pretty striking. So again, the real estate managers will tell you all the techniques because they all get together and talk about it. The thing I would encourage you that you talked about, Dan, which was great, is the flexible workforce. I think that most companies have really seen the biggest gains there in reducing their footprints. You're already on that, so I don't know what best practices you're missing. But again, you could ask real estate managers because they're usually involved in that too.
It's interesting, it has this nexus with the technology work that Steve's been really leading over the last several years. We found that by pushing to the cloud, it's easier to make people more flexible and mobile. The other thing is it makes our whole operation more resilient. After Superstorm Sandy, we had folks who were able to get right back into the system to help get the government stood up and working again. One of our heroes up in New Jersey, she found her way to the one coffee shop in the neighborhood that had Wi-Fi still working. She's able to log in and help us move forward.
Well, I was just going to say, being in the restaurant business, company owned, we deal a lot with real estate and these issues, and and distributed and people holding on. And I would just reiterate, we moved towards a centralized real estate organization and pulled the decision making from the individual concepts because that just doesn't work. Real estate is a core functional expertise, and there's no argument that says that I, in this agency, have a different lens I need to put on real estate. Real estate is about ROI. What are you getting out of it? So that is absolutely functionalized and centered everywhere. I can't imagine there's any argument left out there that would fly, and I'm sure they could make it, but the facts just don't support that in the private sector. You're never going to find anyone heavily real estate dependent who allows that to exist in the business units anymore. So I just think that ship has sailed, and so the government needs to go, well, no one does it this way anymore. Perhaps they're right.
Is that an evolution though? Could we point to?
There's no one that does it anymore.
Ago and say
20 years, you can point to 15 years ago, yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the restaurant industry, it was slow to react, right? Because particularly in our industry, where casual dining, where it's founders, where you didn't have a lot of infrastructure, right? So for Carrabba's, they got to control their own because no one wanted to ruffle the founder, and Outback controlled its own and ruffled the founder. So we were probably a little bit analogous to the federal government in that nobody wanted to disturb the different founders. That has had to change just because there's no expertise out there. Analytics exist, and it's simply the argument for having a particular expertise that's only suited to how it's just very hard to stack that up. So yeah, I would say that over the last X amount of years, that certainly anyone that wants to compete in a slow growth environment has kind of acknowledged that there can be productivity and efficiency that come out of that. The one thing I would just say, and how do you get people to, you were saying, I wrote down, how do you get people to buy into that and everything? One of the challenges that you guys always have is that there's no penalization for inefficiency. And so the way you get it in business is that capital and real estate isn't free. There's an expense portion of capital and depreciation that flows through your P&L that you are measured on. So the impetus to get rid of underperforming assets and to clear your balance sheet of those and have a reserve is there because you are measured on that. You need to set up, I know there's, after 2.5 years on this, I know there's limitations, but unless you have some benefit towards clearing under appreciation or tax back to you in the form of depreciation expense that you're measured on, why are you going to get a groundswell of impetus? So I think you need to figure out how to incorporate that accountability on capital allocation efficiency into your performance metrics of these different agencies.
Because right now it's largely centrally managed.
Yeah, I just wanted
the business units aren't, or the program units are not feeling the cost of their consumption.
Right, and that's why even though it's centrally managed on real estate at our company,
you're pushing
the
cost
costs
down.
flow through the individual concepts.
Yeah, I was going to make the exact same point. We had a period of time where capital was free. People were only looking at income statement, not the balance sheet.
Right.
They weren't charged for the depreciation. So build a building doesn't cost you anything. It costs corporate. So I don't know the extent to which it's feasible for you to apply a depreciation charge, have capital ROI metrics, but that's when it starts to, that's when they get to pay attention to it.
We actually do annual financial statements for each of the agencies. It does include depreciation, but depreciation isn't used in decision making in any meaningful way.
Yeah, but if you want them to take ownership,
that you have to do. And that did happen in businesses a while ago, which was, no, actually, capital isn't free. Here's your expense, and the expense portion of capital, here's your bottom line target. If you don't hit that.
Yeah, one of the other points.
The opposite here, right? Though, sorry. I completely agree with the point, but here it may be marking to market, because all of the real estate here is probably among the best real estate in the world. But it's not that expensive because it's been on the books for, ages. So, it actually might be the reverse here, which is
That's interesting. That is the one thing. If you're within the GSA portfolio, we do actually rent the property at a 3-year, we do an annual and a 3-year rolling appraisal and adjustment. So we charge market rents. Now what's interesting is, this is the way it's structured, we don't get to make market reinvestments in the property. So people get very grouchy about the fact that I pay a market rent, but I'm not in a market
I think just a couple of quick points, if I may. I think when I look at your situation, it's probably more analogous to merger and integration than operating an existing business. If you put two large businesses together, you have a control and a rationalization process. You have duplicate sites. You have different leases, different terms, et cetera, and you have often inadequate control in the sense that one side knows a lot more than the other side knows in that process. So I would think about it more as an analog to two large organizations coming together or several small ones, and how do you get control over that process with the inventory and some critical decision making. I think it does have to be top down, and I think the way you control it is, given the lead time for real estate, you control it with a multi-year strategic plan integration, so that your real estate is not a separate activity from your business planning. It is an integral part, and just as people would have goals for productivity, for customer service performance, there are multi-year goals for real estate rationalization and facility, which would get you there. That also permits you to integrate the technical infrastructure to move more into not just hoteling, but telework, where people actually work at home. And the infrastructure and metrics have to be in place to make that work. But at Aetna, we got up to about 50%, 40,000 people working at home. Needless to say, it did wonders for our real estate footprint. Our productivity went through the roof. Customer satisfaction was extremely high because it was a privilege to work at home. It was highly valued, and it was something that people couldn't get and really wanted to be able to maintain.
Dan, a question for you on it, because I think there's probably violent agreement amongst this group about top-down, but we also have the benefit of, I think most of us would say we have a single mission, that we would hope to have a single mission in our companies, and you've got agencies with many missions. So if you think about the agencies in the intelligence realm versus others, what do you think your addressable opportunity is? And realistically speaking, there's only so much top-down you can do, it would seem. I mean, you can provide templates, perhaps, to some of those intelligence agencies who I think would be pretty resistant to your meddling.
Yeah, so we control about 10% of the federal real estate at GSA.
Okay.
We control somewhere around 40 or 50% of the office space.
Okay.
The part that we don't control is really DoD and intelligence. And
Is what?
Is DoD and intelligence. So in a way, you move into the addressable opportunity is not a small one. We have 1/3 of a billion square feet of office space. Even at that, half of the office space level. So the question is, can we work with agencies that, even if their missions are very different, we're talking about pretty much a common asset, and finding ways then to actually get agencies to think collaboratively and cross-agency hierarchy. So even within agencies, they're pretty stovepipe. John's agency is a good example of that.
One of the real incentives, I think, for all of us is we know we're never going to get capital money for example, our R&D facilities. And so, and Dan's changed the culture at GSA to the point where we're actually comfortable working with GSA on a public-private partnership. We have 14 acres in Cambridge, Massachusetts, abutting MIT at our Transportation Research Center. It's our thought leaders for a lot of the transportation work. We're never going to be able to renovate that 1960s era space in R&D facilities. But we have one-story buildings and surface parking lots in some of the most valuable real estate in the country. We're doing a public-private partnership to unlock some of that FAR, some of the value, and get renovated facilities as part of it. That's a relatively easy sell because we can get directly to the core mission for our employees, and they see the benefit in that one.
What strikes me, if you're already charging market rent, it's mark to market and it's market rent, one way to incent people is to reduce their rent if they reduce the square footage. So you can get people to free up half of the property by scooching in the way you're doing, and cut the rent in half, even though you haven't disposed of the building.
Oh yeah.
And then you use the other half of the building.
We only charge them for the space.
The space they use. So why aren't they incented to do what you did? I mean, it's free money for them.
Yeah, I think it does get into the actual turf war. I mean,
so in other words, they'd rather overspend their budget than
can I speak to that? Because I think we're dealing with a historical problem because we didn't have Dan heading GSA for years. And the view in the field is we have 70,000 employees, we have 150,000 structures, many of them are not GSA, but the view is GSA charges market rates, is completely insensitive to what's going on in our community. We see that we're paying way more than other people should be paying. We're stuck with it. And the idea of incentives are not historically there, I think. I mean, we're seeing it with innovations right now with Dan working with our Denver center where we have 10,000 employees across in our siloed Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, et cetera. I think we have to tackle those big kind of moving pieces and show our workforce, which is very skeptical. Their view is we are getting killed in terms of our budgets by what GSA top-down is telling us we have to pay for real estate in our community, and we know that we should be doing better than that. That's kind of the cultural challenge that we have, I think.
But just for point of clarification, so if they're paying it and they don't like the rate, but they're stuck paying it, why don't they scooch into smaller quarters and reduce the rate? I mean,
because
they're arguing over square footage, just reduce the square footage.
I was in Moab, Utah 2 summers ago. We have Park Service over here, we've got BLM over here, we have USGS over here. They're not consolidated. The leases come up every 5 or 10 years. There's not a nice, obvious entry point often, I think, for those negotiations. I think that's right. I think that's the key, is to use those entry points and have more of a menu of how, and empowering the agencies to realize if they work with the newly created people at GSA, you can save money, because we do feel it in our budget. There's no doubt about that. But we historically have not had kind of the lean-in, I would say, from GSA. So we have a cultural kind of thing to get over here.
But you're providing that service now for different agencies through your portfolio analytics process.
So we're doing portfolio analysis, the problem with the portfolio analysis, though, I have to say, is it takes a long time to do, and we're feeling this burn right now. We have leases expiring right away. So we have to strike some balance between immediate and emergent response, as well as having this long-term strategic plan. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, our engine was just kind of running happily along. We'd get the leases, we'd renew the leases. No one wanted less space, right? There was always an interest in a little more, so we're trying to find them extra room. So we've gone through this massive shift in the way we need to relate to the agencies, and frankly, the agencies need to relate to us. You add to that then decades of kind of experience and legend and you know, clear, obvious, you know, mistakes. So it makes for an interesting job. I'm wondering if I actually want it anymore.
Dan, can I just clarify a point that David made, or one of you two can respond? Why would GSA be charging above market rents?
I would argue that, you know, it's like any price. If I publish a price, you can go find a store that's selling it for cheaper. We aren't. We're doing it under a law that says how we will determine our rents. We're forced to charge market rates so that we aren't actually cheaper than commercial real estate, so that there is a make-buy decision that agencies get to make. There's a bigger question, and it's one maybe for a follow-on discussion, perhaps with the CFOs or real estate folks, and that is how do you actually finance then smart capital investments, such as the consolidation of the space in Moab. We've been in Moab for quite some time. We're probably going to stay in Moab. Why are we in a market that doesn't have a facility that can fit all of DOI's needs? Why aren't we building one? And so the question comes then to how we finance things in the federal government, particularly on the real estate side. It gets pretty complex and gets into budget scoring rules that are deep and interesting, but it's worth a conversation to help us start thinking about maybe ways we can change that.
Dan, I think the Cambridge example is a good one. So how do you think about it now? How do you think about it when you're saying it's this prime real estate in Cambridge, and you know you can do different things with it? So how do you go about making that strategic decision? I'd be curious as to whether you should even own it or whether you should not own it. And
our job is to find those opportunities by talking to agencies. So I've started a whole round of going from agency to agency. And, they've all been very kind to let me in the door the first time. I wanted to do it the second, but and try to identify opportunities. This particular location that John was talking about was something that he was thinking about, something we recognized as an opportunity too, and we just sparked a conversation and said, let's go pursue requests in the marketplace. And part of it is also then challenging the marketplace to give us their ideas. So we're doing a lot of requests for information now, RFIs, which say, we don't know what the right answer is. We don't know what the interest in the marketplace is. Here's the asset. Give us your ideas. We did that with the FBI building. We've done it with a whole set of 6 federal office buildings down an area we're calling Federal Triangle South, where the floor area ratio, the developable FAR is a 3x multiple of what's there now. So we have all this potential real estate energy stored in those facilities that aren't fully utilizing their developable area. We need to go to the marketplace and ask them, okay, how would you take down 6 million square feet?
In Cambridge was an easy one for us in the sense that we knew we had to do something, and because it's an R&D facility, a big part of the value is its location. We can get people at government salaries because they're rubbing elbows with the private sector and the MIT people and the other intellectual resources that make their jobs worth doing. We just needed the facilities to do that, and the value capture part of it is easier here than it's going to be on almost any other transaction that we do, and it has the added bonus of being consistent with the master plan that the city of Cambridge has for the area. So the community revitalization part of it works as well.
I'd like to maybe echo one more thing that Enrique said. We do call it people and places because I think they're clearly aligned, and I don't know whether you think about what should happen in DC versus what should happen in Utah versus what should happen somewhere else, but we found significant savings, ways to grow people's career, attract the right people by having a people and places strategy.
So call centers, we don't put them in Silicon Valley, right? We put them in Oregon and other places. I'm sure you do the same thing. But, I mean, that's a huge amount of savings. What's that?
Maybe not.
Oh, yeah.
I think the other missing theme that's part of this that is a unique opportunity for us, and I think it goes back to your M&A mindset, is the customer service aspect. You know, the siloed nature of the way we operate government. You go to a strip mall in the middle of America and you'll find 5 different government agencies occupying different spaces in the same strip mall. We have a post office right down the street that we own and things like that. From a federal, you know, serving Americans aspect, you know, outside looking in versus our current inside looking out, you know, mindset here as we think through this, I think could be big. Something Dan and I talked a lot about on consolidation opportunity across the agencies to drive a new model for customer
I think
engagement.
that's where the big savings will be. I mean, I almost think you're better off going city by city, where you know you have a lot of agencies, and you say, how much real estate do I need collectively?
Right.
How many of these buildings do I just sell off? Because by having everyone look at this siloed, you're playing with so many constraints. The human, I want more office space. I'm paying too much for this. What's my incentive to use less of this space when we're still paying for the whole building? I mean, it's like a puzzle piece. And the strategic question of do I sell the property off, yes or no? I'm of the opinion if everybody is not hoteling now, anything you can get that looks like it's at market rate, I would just start selling the stuff off unless it's in a city where it's the only building that you have. So, I mean, if MIT came to you and said, I'll take the Cambridge property off your hands, I would just look at everything with an eye towards yes, because my guess is when you're done, you probably have 50% more real estate than you need.
You know, just picking up on your point and on Ron's, it is a little like an integration. If you took a city that had multiple agencies in it, and the strip malls and whatever, and you said, okay, we're going to treat this like a merger, we're going to have a synergy target.
Right.
And everybody's going to share in that, because that's how you end up rationalizing real estate more often than not in corporate situations where you have, as Ron says, you put them together, you identify cost synergies, and you have a target. And then in this case, you want to, as we've talked about in other contexts, make sure the agencies have skin in the game. They're going to get some benefit from that. So you start in a small place, but one that has multiple agencies, and you say, you guys get together, you rationalize your real estate, we're going to give you a synergy target, and then you're going to get the benefit of that somehow. It comes back to you in your budget. That's the way, I think, that's probably what you were thinking about when you talk about the M&A.
That's what you do in merger integration.
That's what drives it. That's how we, you know, when we did massive real estate rationalizations, it was mostly driven by mergers, where we had to achieve a certain cost synergy by virtue of the merger, and we had a target, and everybody had a stake in it, and that required us, it forced us, it's a gun to the head to rationalize real estate.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanism for accountability is always where it breaks down, where the private sector analogies break down when we try to apply them to the public sector. So I guess my question is, you know, what is the incentive, whether you want to call it, you know, the depreciation charge that maps into the synergy target? What are your options to create that accountability and that benefit to having positive behavior at the business unit levels? Because, you know, whenever we ask that question, it's always like, well, we can't actually do that. I mean,
well, what can
you do in that area?
I think you can do it, though. I think we just haven't done it in the past. But right now,
that
because
would be
when
a
you look
great
at a lot,
step forward.
when you look at a lot of agencies, those costs are being managed at a central level, and they're not being pushed to the different program organizations.
Right.
But it's the program organizations that are making a lot of the consumption decisions.
Right. Yeah.
And the theory would be that as you push those costs down,
Exactly.
it's going to inform their behavior. I don't think there's anything that prevents us from doing that. We just haven't done it.
I think
Because that's the charge that goes on, that if they shrink, they benefit, but if it grows, they
But if you got everybody in that, start with a relatively small pilot of one city where they have multiple things, and you say, we're going to have a synergy target, and if you all achieve this, you get to share in that benefit. And they each get.
So I think,
Then you get a
And I
win.
think-
You can then commercialize to other people, market.
And one thing that should be helpful is that this is happening in the private sector. I mean, as someone said earlier, in a slow growth environment, you got to look for all the areas where you can save money and where you can, invest in other places. And I know there was a time when, government executives compare themselves to corporate executives. And I remember years ago I interviewed for a job at the FCC, and the person who was interviewing me apologized because the office that I would have had if I took the job didn't have a door. And she's like, well, this is going to be a big thing for you. But I mean, in these days and times, most, as you said, people are hoteling or sitting out in cubicles in the private sector. So why shouldn't the government do this? Why should you take a government job and expect a huge office because you came from that in the private sector? Things have just changed so dramatically in the private sector that should be helpful.
I think that to get to that point, I think some of our changes are lagging, and so in many ways we're reflecting the last change, which was to try to push a bunch of decision making out at the lowest level, and then try to aggregate at central level with just budgets and costs. But now we have to start driving down those budgets and costs, and maybe we need to start pulling some of that decision making back up further north, because at the end of the day, there's going to be very little incentive in the field level to get less real estate. If my budget's going down, can I at least keep my big office? And the answer is actually no. Your budget's going down. You better hand back the big office because.
But then, what do you get out of that, right? Because people are human. So what do I get? Because in the private sector, you do have a synergy target, and if you exceed it, you're rewarded, and if you don't hit it, then you're penalized. So
But in an environment now where what you're getting are furloughs and what you're getting are program cuts, I think that
and you're losing people.
More.
There's one other potential incentive that really is maybe federal oriented, but very real. Right, we're trying to get our siloed folks to get together and have more shared services. Right, so our silos all have their own fleets. They all have their own IT. Well, we're centralizing that, but there are a lot of services, HR, whatever. If they were in one location, you could have shared services. Now, that just takes away from their program money. And they get that. They like the idea. So in some locations, not so much cities, or big cities, but areas where look, we're all going to get together, you're going to save money on your fleets because you have smaller fleets because we're going to share those cars, we're going to save money. There's something there, I think. That's one of the things we're using. We have a huge problem with the fact that our field structure is in all kinds of places, and not the regional structure isn't centralized in Atlanta for the Southeast, whatever. So we want to kind of, over time, pull people together, and we're looking, and I think that's one incentive that we potentially can take advantage of.
And even though you centralize the decision making at a higher level, that doesn't mean you can't work with the business units to design the space in a way that might work better for them. I mean, you don't can't push down everything. But you say this is how much space you have. Let's talk about, are they cubicles, or is it, shared space? How do you design it in a way that's works for the individual departments or whatever? I know that's how we do it. It's like this is what you have. You can tell us how you can work better in a particular design, but at least that keeps the business units still involved in the decision-making process.
It's really interesting. I'm wondering at Blooming Brands, did you have a problem where you had distributed corporate expertise in this area, so that you had different people arguing over who was right about the way to manage that strategy?
We were completely decentralized. I mean, to the point where if you were going in a market, the JVP partner that controlled, let's say, 8 restaurant span, was in charge of going, I think that's the right property. I talked to Sally, who knew Bill, who said Ted, and it said that this turns a lot. I mean, that's where we were. And so the decision would be made there, right? And then the project work would then be paid for at corporate. We had to flip it, right? Which is all, so implement all analytics, all, now there's still a role for the JVP to say, you know what, here's some things, but to Debbie's point, here's some things that you're not going to be spit out by your ROI and data analytic model that you need to consider at the marketplace. But once that decision is made, then it's pushed out, versus it used to be, this is what we're opening, here's the bill, please build it.
So,
we
they
had to
thought,
flip it.
So the answer is they thought they had expertise in these JVPs
Right.
that was not effective.
Well, it's hard. So much of this is about analytics versus intuition,
Exactly.
right? And that's the big change in private, in our industry, in the hospitality industry. Yes, the way we talk to people, it's a marriage of the science and the art. You can't go all science. So you can't go, we're going to sit here and centralize everything and spit out the ROI and here's your map. However, you've got to lead with the facts. So we did have to swap the decision rights.
So, it occurs to me, Dan, that while all of us here would say that in our worlds, complete centralization of the expertise and the decision-making is optimal, that's probably a bridge too far for you guys to get from here to there. And so an alternative would be to empower those local experts to work together to generate a cost savings target in a particular community. Let them feel the ownership of it, bring their respective expertise, and kind of force them to collaborate because they have a shared goal.
And then hold that up as a best practice.
Yeah, once you get that done in one community, and that community proves that they've saved money and they've worked well together, you can scale it across others.
I don't think, I don't think anyone would say complete centralization is right. I know in our business it would die, right? And in any company, the minute you say centralized, so I would strongly encourage you to never use the word centralized. No, seriously, that's first and foremost. Never use the word centralized. Center of expertise that they input in, that they own, that we all benefit from. Because I do think I do think bad things happen when everything's sucked to the center and you don't have any local input. But I think it's that tension between having the color and the expertise on the ground, but the analytics and facts have to rule the day at the end of the day. But they have to feel like they have skin in the game, that their input is important, that you're not just telling them what to do.
But I guess what I'm saying is the model that we operate under is probably not one that realistically in the short term you can get to. And therefore, to me at least, the step in that direction is to empower the local groups with very clear targets that they're going to benefit from achieving. And they get help from the center, or whatever word you want to use, that other place. But in terms of expertise and the rest, but they own it. They feel accountable for it. And that way it's not being foisted on them.
Maurice, from your perspective at HUD, how does all of this conversation relate to your real estate issues?
It leaves out one big issue. Congress has a play in real estate.
Now, what does that mean? If you close a site and a congressman doesn't like that?
I have 81 offices right now. I'm trying to close 16 of them. These offices were originally structured in the way they're structured now in 1968.
Oh my God.
They do not make operational and business sense, but boy, do they make political sense. And so you tell the congressman from X community that we're about to close his office, he says, come on up to my office for me. In fact, so I'll give you a story. So I went to a congresswoman's office and I said, we are closing your office but we're going to serve your constituents from an office that we're already serving them from.
Right.
In the same state. She looked at me and she said, have you been confirmed?
Oh my God.
And I said, yes, ma'am. She said, do you have to be reconfirmed? I mean, it leaves out the fact that these are not just, I used to run a newspaper, so I shut a lot of stuff. This there are just a lot of people who have their hands in your stuff.
But
Right?
And do they
So
care?
I'm
And
gonna
do
you
they
got
care
to be
about
able
it?
to, you got to be able to manage that part of it too.
Yeah. And do they care about it? Well, why do they care about it? From the jobs perspective, or?
The building's probably named after them.
No, I think
perspective
there
could be
are
it.
two pieces to it. There's a symbolic piece of it that is really significant, that here I am, I can't keep a federal office open in my district. What am I supposed to tell my constituents? Right? So whether it makes good business sense or not, does it make good political sense? How do I stand up and tell my constituents I couldn't keep? And if you're, let's just say right now, if you're a Democrat with a Democratic president, how do I tell my constituents that I couldn't, with a Democratic president, keep a HUD office open and fill in the blank?
But here's the
that's a part
question.
of it.
Does that still stop you from doing it? I mean, if that's the case, we'll never close anything.
No, it doesn't stop you.
Yeah.
All I'm saying
You
is
gotta put it in the equation.
You got to put that in the equation.
Yeah.
I don't know, Gil. I would
it's
tell
a
you.
huge
Just
hurdle.
plow through it.
And
But Gil,
it's not that simple. I wish it
Never
were that
is.
simple, but you plow through and then you get up at an appropriations hearing and they go, "Oh yeah, I remember you, Mr. Deputy. Welcome
Yeah,
to
but-
the committee meeting."
But
So it's
that
you have
happens
to
in
be
the
able
private
to-
sector too. I mean, we close down one little piece of one biomedical center, and I heard from the congressman. I mean, we're kind of talking, if we can't close anything.
So I wasn't suggesting that
Yeah.
we can't. We are
No, but you're right,
doing
that
it.
is a
What
fact
I'm
that you
suggesting
have to
is we
Yeah.
haven't,
It's an additional
to
hurdle.
this moment,
Yeah.
we haven't talked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a big
Yeah.
one.
And just remember
You
what
have to
happens.
walk in with a strategy
As
get
to
past
why.
that, or
Yeah.
you're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Definitely have to.
Because we're going to go to the no set if you can't close anything down.
Are there strategies that get you past it?
Oh yeah, you
Yeah.
could, but it is a real
factor.
piece of the equation.
But
The other
I
thing
do
I
think
would,
it speaks to this notion of the coordinated agency approach too, though.
Yeah.
That if we're sending each agency into each congressional office to wrestle over each, storefront,
Yes.
Never gonna
maybe
happen.
that's the approach to your point.
In unity is strength.
Empowering the agencies
Who do
to
you
work
shoot?
together, partner around a strategic plan, and say, then go, as John said, with a plan to those offices and say, okay, here's how we're going to do it.
that would be much stronger. The challenge is, that's not the way we operate as a government right now. So, we're in space in a southern city right now. There's a federal building in that same southern city that has space. It makes sense for us to be in that federal building. We could save money, even if we didn't save money. The fact is, we work with other federal partners.
Right.
So what prevents you from doing that?
Yeah.
One is not in bad relationships between us and GSA at that level. Right? So I think at bottom, a lot of this is relationship based in us and our ability to improve our relationships. Another is, I think, what Dan was alluding to, which is right now we lease in private space. We feel a little more control over that. Right. A third one is there isn't an obvious economic incentive to do it to the folks who are in Atlanta. I've got to come down and say, you got to get this done. And frankly, of all the alligators I'm wrestling with, this one probably doesn't rise. I may get to it in the third year. Right? So there are lots of factors that conspire, if you will, to keep us from being better at this. And Dan will be gone in so many years, and I'll be gone. And I'll be gone.
You have a permanent appointment.
Right, I'll be gone in so many years, and whether the next person after me believes this is worth getting at or not. I mean, this is, all of these things are part of the, now, having said all of that, we can do it, but you got to get up every day doing this stuff.
I will say, and this is why I asked about the structure of Blue and Branson, your evolution there. A lot of what we deal with is we have a real estate function that deals with agency real estate functions, and there is this sense that the agency real estate function has the expertise and knowledge that reflects the agency's actual needs and priorities. It does get to issues of control and authority and responsibility. A lot of those people are former GSA people who then bring their GSA horror stories to the agency to give back to GSA.
Well, that's why you have to. It has to be. It has to be a benefit of both. Like you can't.
Yep. Decision
rights both have to have inputs in it, and decision rights, and
But if I'm the secretary at one of these local agencies and I just say, you know what, I do want to go with GSA, I'm going to take my real estate person and repurpose that person to being a programs person. Right? Couldn't the secretaries or the, at HUD, for example, couldn't the secretary say, I don't want to have this real estate person anymore? I mean, that's what happens in business, right? The business manager says, I got choices I can make. I can put more resources to doing things where I can get some center of excellence help, I learned, or I can have another program. So does the secretary not have the ability to, or does he just not trust that they have a great person in Dan who can actually do a good job for them?
So I think they're a combination. Yes, you can make that call. I no longer need to be in the real estate business.
Right.
So then you work with the unions, and then you work with GSA if you trust GSA, right? You really have to. I don't want to underestimate the trust issue here. It's a big one. The trust issue is a huge one here, and so you can't quantify that, but I'm telling you, that is a big part of the picture here. If we could get better trust amongst agencies within the federal government, we would find ways to get the yes, even with all these challenges. But the fact of the matter is, we have a trust issue that's gigantic. I know Dan. I'm willing to trust Dan. He's my teammate. We're going to find ways to work. Yes. He and I are sitting up here trying to figure out what's going on. Meanwhile, folks on the day-to-day level.
And I think the fact that, as Dan said, Congress requires us to pay market rates, period. There's no sense that there are no deals to be made here, right? So our guys are very, we have to give it to GSA to do this work. We've got to pay top dollar. There's nothing, this is not good, But I think if we work, what we're trying to do with Dan now is find these other ways to show that there will be savings and efficiencies and all of that. But
we shouldn't lose that thread of the city-by-city approach here because
right.
all of us, we could pick 5 or 6 cities right now,
Exactly.
and all of us have a footprint there. You need to match up the lease cycles and figure out.
We're trying to get victories here. We're working with Dan in Denver, which is a huge center for us.
Yeah.
We need victories. We need a new narrative. We need new stories. GSA is our partner, and we can save money, and we can be better off.
That's right.
And there's a
how to make inroads on history.
That's right. And so it's doable. I'm optimistic about it, but I also want to make sure
that we understand the challenge.
It is a challenge.
Whenever you put change through, so this pivot, what you guys can do, and even further up, is champion the people that are courageous enough at the lower levels to do something different and make sure that because everyone has to tell it, make sure that they are recognized, make sure that they are championed, make sure that they become, the model of what you're looking for, and that people know that, right? So that is how you drive change from the top too, is that people that do take the risk at the bottom and do collaborate and do things in a different way, you make a very public acknowledgement that this is the new way of doing things, and this is the kind of folks that we want, and this is the kind of behavior we're going to reward.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic segue into the innovation section. I think you should say the exact same thing. But before that, we should jump into a break.
Okay.
So you know,